When you're ready to use a class, as you would expect, you would go ahead and declare a variable. The thing we've got to be aware of, though, is that declaring a variable simply allocates space to store what we call a reference to the actual object we want to use. To actually create an instance of our class, otherwise known as an object, we have to use the new keyword. So we've got our variable NYC to SF. We assign that the value of new flight. What that then does is the call to new flight allocates the memory associated with that class and then returns back a reference to it. So what that means is that that variable NYC to SF is not the object itself, but a reference to the object. Right now, each instance that we create will be separate from one another. And as you see here that I've actually declared the variable and then assigned the object to it in two separate statements. We can, of course, do that in a single statement. So I've got a variable SLC to Dallas equals new flight. Right, that allocates out the SLC to Dallas, which is the space for the reference, creates the instance of flight, and assigns the reference to our variable. So each of these are two distinct instances of our flight object in each of their own variables. And we can then call a method on one of those instances. In this case, we'll call add one passenger on our SLC to Dallas, which will cause our passengers to go from 0 to 1. As we saw when we were using our classes and creating class instances, these objects, we saw that the variable wasn't the object itself, instead it was a reference to the object. And that tells us that we're working with reference types. And that has important implications when it comes to working with objects. So we look at some code here. If I declare a variable flight1 that points to a new flight, right, that allocates out the variable flight1, allocates out the instance of our object, and puts a reference to that object in the flight1, I do the same thing for flight2, right? That creates a separate object and assigns it into a separate variable, flight2. So those two objects are completely separate from one another, right? So if I call add one passenger on flight2, the object instance pointed to by flight2 will have its passengers incremented from 0 to 1. So of course, if I print out flight2 passengers, it prints out 1. Now, if I assign flight1 to flight2, that doesn't copy the entire object pointing to by flight1 into flight2. All that does was reassign the reference so that flight2, instead of pointing to the object it currently points to, will now point to the same object that flight1 points to. So now once that object pointing to by flight2 or previously pointing to by flight2 is no longer referenced, that object goes away, and flight2 and flight1 are pointing now to the exact same object. If I now print out flight2.passengers, it prints out 0, right, because that's the value of passengers in the object it's pointing to. So now if I work through flight1 and I say add one passenger, where that increments passengers from 0 to 1, of course. If I then call add one passenger again on flight1, that increments it from 1 to 2. So now if I print out flight2.passengers, I get out the value 2. I print out the value 2, right? So it's important to understand that when we make these assignments, we're assigning references around, not entire objects. Right? This is very different from when we were working with primitive types, where the values were actually copied around. So it's really important to understand that as reference types, assignments cause us to point to the same object instances as opposed to making complete copies.